Hey guys, Treeb Squire here, and today I'm going to be having a look at the performance of the Palit GTX1080 Gamerock Premium Edition. I actually bought this card to replace my 980 Ti SLI setup as, quite frankly, SLI is shit. So many new games over the last year, including Homefront the Revolution, Doom, Warhammer Total War, Just Cause 3, Fallout 4 and Batman Arkham Knight, to name a few, have shipped with no SLI support, making my second GTX 980 Ti a £600 paperweight. Even after some of these games had SLI patched in, the scaling wasn't exactly great. I've actually found that in a number of these games, and others with SLI support from day one, the GTX 1080 runs them better, if not the same, due to the GPU usage being much higher. Unlike a number of benchmarks released with the GPU reviews, I'm going to be completely maxing every game as high as they will possibly go, with the only exception being super sampling. In the description I've put a timeline so that you can skip to the titles you want to see. I'm not going to go into every detail as to what settings I use, but I will show you the graphic settings and go straight into gameplay so that you can see there's no trickery. One last note, these games are all running at 1440p. So let's get started. First up, Batman Arkham Knight. This game is infamous for being an absolute disaster on launch. It was in such bad shape that it was actually withdrawn from sale by Warner Brothers, and even after its re-release, it still doesn't support SLI. For this, I've set everything to the highest settings with all of the Gameworks options turned on. Now this is how the game should have run on release. Even in the Batmobile blowing up everything in sight and that glorious physics smoke, the frame rate never dips below 60 and the game looks stunning. Next up, Doom. Probably the biggest surprise of the year so far, Doom defied all expectation and was an awesome throwback to shooters of old. For this, I'm running the game on nightmare settings with Vulkan enabled and 8x TSS-AA. As you can see, we're running at well over 100 frames per second. The game is incredibly well optimized and is smooth as butter. Let's hope that the next Wolfenstein follows suit. And next we have Fallout 4. Much like Arma 3, this is a game that is impossible to keep it above 60 frames per second on the max settings, even with the almighty GTX 1080. You see a lot of sites posting benchmarks saying that the game runs at 90 plus frames per second, but that's just because the benchmarks are being done way outside of the city. Once you get into the city centre, the frame rate can drop all the way into the 30s and jumps all over the place. On my two 980 Ti's, the GPU usage would regularly drop down to 50% per card and even below. Like I said, once you get out of the city, you can see it jump straight up into the 90s and can go up over 100. GTA 5 is a great example of how to do a port right, and the game scales incredibly well. I've seen videos of people running the game using onboard graphics in laptops, which is pretty impressive. As with most games on this list, a lot of the benchmarks I've seen don't have every single setting turned all the way up, so for this I have all the sliders on absolute max and the anti-aliasing as high as it can go. Unfortunately, at this setting the game does struggle to maintain 60 frames per second in some parts and does drop to the 50s, but generally runs very smoothly. If you just tweak a couple of settings like turning down anti-aliasing and turning down a couple of sliders by a small amount, you can easily achieve 70 plus FPS on average. I would say Homefront the Revolution is a candidate for worst port of the year, but it turns out even the console version is a complete mess as well. When I would run the game on my 980 Ti's, it would regularly drop into the 40 to 50 frames per second range and was all round very unstable, even if I turned some of the settings down. On the 1080, however, with all settings on max, the game runs pretty damn smooth and rarely drops below 60. I refused to play the game on launch due to the terrible performance, but now that I can run the game smoothly, I might give it another go. Just Cause 3 was the second biggest disappointment this year for me, and I'll get to the first later. It was a game with great mechanics but a ridiculous amount of filler crap that the game forced you to do in order to continue the story. It's also another game that came out this year with no SLI support and still doesn't to this day, but fortunately it runs exceptionally well on a variety of hardware. Running the game with all settings as high as they can go, the game sits around the 90 to 100 frames per second mark, dipping occasionally into the 80s. Much like Doom, Shadow of Mordor was another very pleasant surprise on release, both in terms of the game itself and the quality of the PC version. Playing like Assassin's Creed in a Lord of the Rings setting, everything from the gameplay to the graphics were top notch. The only downside was it having the worst ending I've experienced in a game since Kane and Lynch 2, and that's really saying something. With all the settings as high as they can go, it sits around the 80 to 90 frames per second mark, going up to 100 and over on occasion. On the opposite side of the surprise spectrum, Mirror's Edge Catalyst was the biggest disappointment for me this year. It was still a decent game at its heart, but the lazy sandbox implementation, repetitive combat and boring characters stopped it from being able to surpass its predecessor. Graphically, however, the game was absolutely stunning. It did have some performance issues on release, but now those seem to have mostly been patched out, and the game runs at a minimum of 70 frames per second, often sitting around the 80 to 90 mark. Rainbow Six Siege is my favourite shooter online in many years. Since release, I've put nearly 200 hours into the game, which is almost unheard of for me. Performance wise, if you put everything up as high as it can go, including 4x TXAA, then the game jumps up and down between 60 and 80 frames per second, with dips into the 50s. If you do, however, turn down anti-aliasing to just temporal, then it jumps to over 100 frames per second and stays there, which is definitely the preferred option if you want to play this online. I've been playing games since the days of the Commodore 64, and I can genuinely put my hand on my heart and say that The Witcher 3 is the best game I've ever played. It's the culmination of everything I've ever wanted in a game, and it firmly cemented CD Projekt Red in the same leagues as devs like Rockstar, who care more about making great titles than they do annual cash cows. It may not look as good as the E3 presentations, but it's still one incredibly good looking game. Most of the benchmarks I have seen disable things like hairworks, which boost the FPS, but for this every dial is turned all the way up and the frame rate still never dips below 60, usually sitting around the 60 to 70 FPS mark. If you don't own this game yet, then I heartily recommend giving it a go. In conclusion, the GTX 1080 is a beast of a card, and the Palit Gamerock Premium Edition, whilst not the sexiest 1080 out there, runs incredibly cool and comfortably maxes out most games at 1440p. My only issue with the card so far is that every time I've tried to overclock the core clock, it crashes any game I play after a couple of minutes. I'm not hugely fussed about overclocking, but it would be nice to have the option. I've read some reviews that say they've got some impressive overclocks on this card, so it may just be a fault with this one specifically. As always, thanks very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please let me know with a like and subscribe, or a dislike if you thought it was rubbish. Thanks for watching, and see you on the next one.